Well, the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture going to resume tomorrow. Eskom board chairperson Jabu Mabuza is going to continue his testimony. Aaron Bates watching that for us. And just when we thought we had a great scene in the beginning, bombshells were being dropped there. We all thought, didn't we, Aaron Bates, that when somebody involved in Eskom would come in, they would be guarded. They would be very careful in the information they give out. And then we have Mabuza, who's arrived on the scene, and it's all fallen over, hasn't it?
To a degree. I think he was a little cagey on some of his directorships, and that's certainly been a concern for the EFF. They've raised concerns over conflicts of interests because Jabu Mabuza, and he did disclose this at the inquiry, one, has an interest in a company that does a third of Eskom's boilers, and two, his family has a partnership with a company that has a lot of coal deals with Eskom. Now, he disclosed this when he was appointed to the commission. He says his 26 million rands worth of shares in one company have been put into a blind trust, but it is a concern for the EFF that someone with those kinds of business interests would be heading up a so-called clean-up board at the power utility. And
I imagine that the state capture inquiry, while no doubts will ask those sort of questions, they're not going to take their lead from the EFF. Of course, they're not here for the EFF's main ends and goals, but those questions are going to be asked as to how did you get to a point where someone in your position has 26 million rand to start investing in this? How were you able to invest in that? We're very much down the rabbit hole, aren't we, Dorothy?
Yes, my name's still Aaron, but I get the metaphor. And those questions were first put to Mabuza by Advocate Vincent Maleka, Senior Counsel for the inquiry. So the EFF have in fact taken the cue from the inquiry and really honed in on these business arrangements. So Mabuza really put those behind him, and then he dealt with the concerns about what the current board found when they arrived at the power utility, how eroded structures had become, the lack of institutional memory and the lack of capacity to maintain the power grid in the country.
So when someone watching the state capture inquiry, and obviously you're watching at a minutiae detail, you're delving down into the granular commentary of someone like Mabuza, but in the end, those watching us this evening are trying to figure out why the lights keep going off. And yes, we're talking about state capture, yes, we're talking about money going missing, but ultimately, in the end, when the power goes off, that comes down to maintenance, it comes down to transmission, it comes down to distribution. And when you unpack the state capture inquiry, especially with Eskom, we begin to understand how this has fallen over and how we are in the state that we're in.
Yes, and Mabuza actually said that they have a skills problem, that they have a deficit in skills at the power utility, putting a lie to, in fact, to the idea that this was all a conspiracy, that the whole crisis we've had recently with Eskom load shedding is some kind of great big political play. Him saying we simply don't have the skills, we don't have the wherewithal internally to be maintaining the power grid. And of course, another concern is the coal supplies, because coal is the primary fuel for the Eskom power grid, and that concern relates not only to companies linked to Mabuza himself through his family trusts and its investments, but also, of course, to the Guptas. But I think critical to note that what we've learned this year at the Zondo Commission is that the state capture project, fraud, corruption, money laundering, and allegations thereof stem not only from business dealings between Gupta-linked entities and state entities, but also the likes of African Global Operations and beyond. I mean, with Eskom, you hear about McKinsey, you hear about regiments, you hear about Trillion, you hear about Tegeta. The list goes on and on. And so as we learn more at the inquiry, we learn that the Guptas are a piece of the puzzle, but the puzzle has many other pieces.
Yeah, there are so many other pieces, and this is where we're going to start looking not forward to, but I suppose those who are following you on social media, it's at ERM Bates, by the way. If you haven't followed Erin, go and follow her. That's what we're looking forward to in the next few days. Yes, we've now understood the holistic view of what this is. I imagine come tomorrow, Erin, we're going to start getting to the granular of each of those particular problems, and hopefully we're going to get some kind of clarity. Whether we get answers is an entirely different scenario, but at least we'll get some clarity.
One would hope so, and Mabuza is really speaking on behalf of the so-called clean-up board. He spoke, for example, about the precarious financial position of Eskom in terms of its guarantees when they arrived in January of 2017. But as we progress further into the week, we're going to get more of those details on specific coal contracts, on specific engagements between Eskom and consultancies like Trillion or McKinsey. And so then we're going to get this deep dive, this sort of deep mining of what what's gone wrong at the power utility and how it fits into this broader sort of investigation that the Zondo Commission is doing. And bear in mind that it has several reports that have already been done by the likes of the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises, National Treasury and the like. So there's plenty at this point of prima facie evidence to go and prosecute people who are involved in the top echelons of Eskom. But with the Portfolio Committee, for example, they kind of deferred any real action and handed that baton over to the Commission.
And I'm so glad you mentioned the word deferred action, because this gets very complicated. You and I would almost need to do a degree in the state capture inquiry and almost on its own into Eskom within the state capture inquiry. For those watching at home this evening, many people are going to ask the question, who cares what comes out of this state capture inquiry? What do they do with this information? Where does it go? Do people end up in jail? Are they losing their jobs? Are they going to face financial penalties? What does this ultimately achieve?
Well, I mean, if you want to speak to people at home, I would say you should care, because it's your electricity, it's your taxes when you pay them that go into maintaining Eskom and ensuring that we have a working power grid. But more broadly speaking, the question of when people will be prosecuted is a critical one. And I mean, if you look at the charges that we've had stemming seemingly, and I must emphasize seemingly, from proceedings at the Zondo Commission, the only people who've been arrested, charged and appeared in court so far are those Bosasa executives and then 2 people formally with correctional services. And interestingly, you know, in light of Dudu Mieni's comments, if you look at the demographics of it, and that's a sort of awkward and delicate game to play, the majority of people charged so far in relation to allegations of fraud, corruption and money laundering are in fact white men. But in terms of actual action, those are parallel processes in a way to what happens at the Commission. Zondo will conclude his work with his team. He will then assess all of the evidence before him, compile a report, and that report can then be used for criminal prosecution. But that's a long and distant destination.
And it's certainly a long and distant destination that's beyond the elections of this year, which is what so many people are talking about. Erin Bates, thank you so much. I mentioned your Twitter handle. It is at ERM Bates. You're live tweeting from the state capture inquiry throughout the entire week. My colleague Erin Bates joining us in here on Newsnight at what is now 12 minutes after 5 o'clock.